On November 10th, 2010, 32-year-old Tina Herman failed to show up for her shift at the local Dairy Queen. Her manager, Valerie Haythorne, immediately knew something wasn't right. And the next day, when Tina missed another shift at work and her two kids missed school, Valerie decided to take matters into her own hands. She went over to Tina's house to investigate, and what she found shocked her to her core. There was blood everywhere. An absolute massacre had occurred in the house, but there were no bodies. As police are searching the crime scene, they came across one major clue left behind in the garage, and this clue would lead directly to a very strange and very disturbed man living right there in their community. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an upload. Today we're talking about the Apple Valley Massacre. But before we get into the case, let's briefly talk about today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Trade. One thing I look forward to each and every day is having my morning cup of coffee. And adding a Trade coffee subscription to my routine has given my family the opportunity to try out lots of different coffees from roasters all over the country. Trade will match you with a coffee best suited to your taste. You can choose decaf or regular, whole bean or ground, and your coffee is roasted to order and shipped to you within 48 hours, so it's always fresh. I usually brew my coffee in just a regular standard coffee maker, but I just recently bought an espresso machine, and I've been having the best time making cappuccinos and lattes for my family with my Trade coffees. And Trade is also making a name for themselves in the cold coffee world. They have these all-in-one cold coffee kits that come with everything you need to make cold brew coffee at home. This is mine. It's the Ovalware cold brew kit, and it comes with a 2-pound bag of coffee, any coffee of your choice, and an Ovalware cold brew maker. The Trade coffee that I have right now is Soulmate from Alma Coffee. It's a medium roast. I've tried this one before. I love it. And the cold brew maker is super simple to use. You add just a little more than a cup of ground coffee to the little basket. Then you add in about 4.5 cups of room temp water, place the airtight lid on top, and pop it in your fridge to steep for about 12 hours or so. I typically do this in the evening before bed so we can drink on it the next day. And I love the cold brew for summertime. It gets really hot where I live. I'm talking like over 100 degrees some days. So having cold brew in my fridge ready to drink throughout the day is really nice for the summer. Trade also offers these super convenient ready to drink cans of cold coffees. This month I have the honey oat latte. This one is really good. Very refreshing on a hot day. I love Trade, you guys already know that, and I'm telling you, if you're a coffee lover and you're interested in trying out coffees from all over the world, a Trade coffee subscription is so worth it. And if you're ready to experience the freshest coffees just in time for summer, go check out Trade's full cold coffee collection at drinktrade.com/summer, and you can subscribe and save 30% off your first order. Thanks again to Trade for sponsoring this video and for keeping me and my family stocked with delicious cold coffees this summer. And now let's jump into the case. 32-year-old Tina Herman was a single mom living in Howard, Ohio. Tina lived with her 13-year-old daughter, Sarah Maynard, and her 11-year-old son, Cody Maynard, and her live-in boyfriend, Greg Borders. Greg and Tina had been together for a while. They had been dating for about 4 years. They had bought a house together in a community called Apple Valley. This was a very nice community, very low crime rate, nice houses, good schools. Tina was working at a local Dairy Queen, and Greg worked at a Target distribution center in West Jefferson, about 60 miles away. The commute to work for Greg was pretty long, so he would have to wake up at around 3 a.m. just to make it to work on time. Tina was a very involved mother. She absolutely adored her children. She was always talking about Sarah and Cody to her coworkers and her friends. Sarah and Cody were both very involved in sports, and Tina was always there for their games and events, cheering them on. Everything seemed to be going really well for Tina and her family. But by November 2010, Tina and Greg's relationship was pretty rocky. They were arguing a lot, they just weren't getting along, and they decided to go ahead and end their relationship. It was decided that Tina would be the one to leave the house, and she was starting to look for another place for her and her children to live. But in the meantime, Tina and the kids and Greg all remained living together in the house. And on November 10th, 2010, Greg woke up at 3 a.m. just like normal. He got ready for his shift at the Target distribution center, and he left and headed to work. Later that afternoon, the police got a call from a woman named Valerie Haythorne. Valerie was Tina's boss. She was the general manager for the Dairy Queen where Tina worked. And Tina had been scheduled to work the 4 p.m. shift that day, and she never showed up. And Valerie was immediately worried. She and Tina had gotten to know each other pretty well, and Tina was known as a very responsible worker. She was always on time. She would never just not show up to work without a call. Valerie also knew that Tina had been having issues with Greg. She knew that they had broken up recently. She knew that they were arguing a lot. This was not not a very amicable breakup. And so when Tina didn't show up to work, Valerie immediately thought that maybe something had happened between Tina and Greg. She tried calling Tina, but she got no answer. So at that point, she decided that it was best to go ahead and at least let the police know that something shady might be going on. So Valerie calls the police and she's like, one of my employees didn't show up for her shift. She's not answering my calls. This is completely out of character. She's been having issues with her boyfriend. Can you please go out and check on her? The police say, sure, no problem. We'll send a deputy out to check on Tina. So the police go out to Tina's house and they didn't get an answer. They knocked on the door. They looked around the area. They didn't really see anything suspicious. And so they left. Now, Tina is a grown woman. It isn't against the law to miss a shift at work. So at this point, there really wasn't much else the police could really do. But the next day, the police would get another phone call from Valerie, except this time the situation was much, much worse. Tina had missed another shift. And again, Valerie had tried to call her, but she got no answer. Valerie was really starting to worry at this point, and she knew that Tina's best friend, Stephanie Sprang, was also her neighbor. So she was thinking maybe she could give Stephanie a call and have Stephanie go down to, check on Tina, or maybe she had seen her. Stephanie Sprang lived just a couple of houses down from Tina, and when Tina moved to the Apple Valley community, she and Stephanie really hit it off. They would go on trips together, they would visit each other all the time, they became pretty much inseparable. If anyone knew where Tina was, it was Stephanie. So Valerie calls Stephanie's house and she learns that Stephanie is also missing. So now Valerie is wondering, did Stephanie and Tina take the kids and leave? Did Stephanie maybe help Tina and the kids leave town to get away from Greg? She didn't know, but she decided to take matters into her own hands. And after she got off work that day, she drove over to Tina's house to check things out for herself. In the past, Tina had mentioned to Valerie that she always left one of her back windows open just in case she or one of the kids ever got locked out. So Valerie walked around the back of the house and she found the open window. She popped off the screen, she pulled open the window, and she crawled into the house and she started looking around. And what she saw was like a horror scene. There was blood everywhere. There were several large pools of blood in various areas of the house. There were bloody trails leading from the pools of blood, and all the trails led to the same place. They all led to the bathroom. And the scene in the bathroom was even more disturbing. There was blood all over the walls, there was blood all over the floor, and the bathtub was full of blood. The bathroom has been described by police as looking like a slaughterhouse, but there were no bodies anywhere. The house was completely empty. Even the family dog was missing. The entire family had just vanished, and all that was left behind was this absolute nightmare of a scene. Valerie, of course, calls the police right away, and she's like, I reported my friend missing yesterday, and she's definitely in serious trouble. I'm in her house right now. There's blood everywhere. You need to get here fast. The police show up, and they quickly realize that they are potentially dealing with a family massacre. With the insane amount of blood found all over the house, Tina and her kids, and maybe even her ex-boyfriend Greg, could be dead. The police contacted Sarah and Cody's school, and they found out that the kids were absent from school on November 11th. They were at school on November 10th, the day that Tina had first went missing, but they were absent the next day on the 11th. So the police start looking around the house, and they notice that Tina's car is missing. But Stephanie Sprang's car is parked in the garage where Tina's car would normally be. And they know that Stephanie is also missing, so now they're worried that she has met the same fate as Tina and her family. They don't see any signs of forced entry. It looked as though whoever did this was either let in by Tina or knew how to easily slip into the house unnoticed. So now at this point, they know that Tina, her two kids, and Stephanie Sprang are all missing. But they weren't sure where Greg Borders was at this point. They didn't know if he was also missing. So they started trying to track him down. And they found him. Greg was actually alive and well, and he seemingly had no clue that something horrific had taken place back at his home. Now, police were, of course, immediately suspicious of Greg. First of all, he was the ex-boyfriend. He and Tina had just broken up, and people knew that this was not an easy breakup. They were not getting along. They were fighting a lot. They also learned that Stephanie Sprang and Tina had plans to meet up to go house hunting the day that Tina went missing. Tina and the kids needed a new place to stay now that she and Greg had called it quits, and Stephanie had volunteered to go with her to look at some potential houses. So this does not look good for Greg. At this point, he becomes the prime suspect. So they bring Greg in for questioning, and they ask him to detail his movements starting on the morning of November 10th. Greg says he got up that morning around 3 a.m., he got ready for work, and then he drove the 60 miles to his job at the Target distribution center. He said that he worked his shift just like normal, but instead of going home after work, he picked up some beer at a gas station and he headed over to a friend's house and he stayed the night there. He said the next day on November 11th, he and his friend went to play golf. Greg said that he had no idea that anything had happened back home, until he got a call from his uncle telling him that there were police and crime scene tape all around their property. And Greg's alibi did check out. His boss confirmed that he was at work all day on the 10th. He was also seen on camera at the gas station picking up beer after work. And his friends confirmed that Greg had been with them since the afternoon of the 10th. So his alibi was airtight. So for now, at least, the police had to move on from Greg. They put a bolo out on Tina's missing car and they just continued processing the crime scene. There was a lot to process at this crime scene. As I mentioned earlier, there were giant pools of blood soaked into the carpet in various rooms of the house, and each of these pools of blood had a bloody trail leading from the puddle to the bathroom. The police determined that whoever had done this had likely killed the victims and then dragged their bodies to the bathroom. And based on what they found in the bathtub, it looked like the bodies had been dismembered in there. They found pieces of bone and tissue along with a large amount of blood in the bathtub, so they were pretty sure that the bodies had been dismembered. And as police are looking around, they can see bloody footprints all around the house, and they realize that there are actually two sets of bloody footprints. One set is large, like the size of a man's shoe, but the other set of footprints is much smaller, and they look like they could belong to a woman or even a child. They determined that the smaller footprint was made from a size 7.5 Airwalk shoe. They could literally make out the word Airwalk in the bloody footprints. And as they were searching the house, they discovered a shoebox for a size 7.5 Airwalk shoe in Sarah's room. So they were pretty sure that that second set of footprints belonged to Sarah. And Sarah's footprints, along with the larger footprints, led right out of the house. Now there's a chance that Sarah could still be alive. They can clearly see that she walked out of the house with someone. At this point, they couldn't say with 100% certainty that the others were dead, but they were pretty sure that that was the case. So this gave them a glimmer of hope that if they could track down the killer fast enough, they could save Sarah. And that night, Tina's truck was discovered about 6 miles away from her house. An officer found the truck abandoned near a hiking trail. Tina's truck was processed for clues. They were looking for DNA, strands of hair, fingerprints, anything that might point them in the right direction, but they found nothing. But back at Tina's house, they got a huge break in the case. In the garage, they found a Walmart bag with an unopened box of 55-gallon garbage bags and multiple unused tarps. So they're looking at these items and they're thinking, you know, these bodies were likely dismembered in that bathtub. And these items, the garbage bags and the tarps, are items that a person might need to dismember and transport a body. What if the killer had purchased these items and just accidentally left them there? So police went down to the Walmart in town and they had them check through the log of their recent sales to see if anyone had come to the store around the time that Tina and the kids went missing and purchased tarps and 55-gallon trash bags. And sure enough, on the night of November 10th, just before midnight, someone had come in and bought the exact same trash bags and the exact same tarps as the ones found in Tina's home. And they could see who the cashier had been that night that checked this person out. They could see exactly what time they had come into the store. And so they checked the security cameras to see if they could get a clear picture of who this person was. And they did. They clearly saw a man wearing a long sleeve camouflage t-shirt, purchasing these items and then walking out into the parking lot and driving away in a silver Toyota Yaris. Unfortunately, they could not make out the license plate number. So instead, they pulled up a list of all the registered Toyota Yaris owners in the county. They pulled the driver's license info of every Yaris owner and they literally just started going down the list looking at photo after photo until they finally came across the driver's license of a 30-year-old man named Matthew Hoffman. And he looked just like the man from the security footage. And not only that, he was wearing the exact same camouflage t-shirt in the driver's license photo as the person they saw in the security footage. And when they started looking into Hoffman, they discovered that his mother lived right down the street from Tina's house. And one of the officers working the case actually recognized Matthew Hoffman right away. He had seen Matthew the night Tina's truck was discovered near that hiking trail. The officer had discovered Tina's truck that night on the trail, and he was walking around the truck, checking it out, seeing if he could find any clues. And as he was inspecting the truck, he noticed that there was a man sitting nearby in the driver's seat of a Toyota Yaris. The man seemed out of place. There was no obvious reason that he would just be parked in such an isolated area, just sitting there. Also, that particular parking lot was closed after dark. This was nighttime, and so no one was supposed to be there. It just seemed off. So the officer walked over and asked the man what he was doing just sitting there, and the man said, "Oh, I'm just waiting for my girlfriend. Her name is Sarah." And despite the very eerie vibe that this guy was giving off, the officer just said, "Okay, okay, well, you need to get out of here. This area is closed after dark. And that was it. The guy left. But now that the officer is looking at the driver's license photo and the man on the surveillance footage, and also the fact that the man was driving a Yaris, they knew that this had to be the same guy. And on top of all that, the man actually said his girlfriend's name was Sarah, as in Sarah Maynard, Tina's 13-year-old missing daughter. Matthew Hoffman has now become their prime suspect, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. So they went and got an arrest warrant for Matthew Hoffman. And on November 14th, just 4 days after Tina, her kids, and Stephanie Sprang went missing, a SWAT team stormed into Hoffman's house and took him into custody. There were drawings all over the walls, and not like framed drawings. No, someone had literally drawn all over the walls. But the strangest thing about this house was the piles and piles of leaves. Leaves were scattered all over the floor. Bags of leaves were nailed to the walls. It was just a very bizarre scene. Once they had Matthew in custody, police started looking around the house. They're looking for Sarah. They look in all the bedrooms. They even thought that she could be hidden under the leaves, but they didn't find anything. And just as they were starting to get discouraged and, thinking that maybe they were too late, one of the officers noticed a dresser was positioned against a wall and it just looked unnatural. This dresser just looked really out of place. And so they slid the dresser over, and sure enough, they found a secret passageway leading down into the basement. And there they found 13-year-old Sarah Maynard, cold, exhausted, tied up, and lying on a bed of leaves. Police told Sarah not to worry, that they were here to help. The police were super emotional. They're crying. Sarah, of course, is just so relieved that her ordeal was finally over. But now police had to find out what happened to the rest of Sarah's family. So police started digging deeper into Matthew Hoffman's life, and they're talking to neighbors and acquaintances, and the impression that they got was that they were dealing with a very disturbed individual. So Matthew Hoffman was born on November 1st, 1980, and he grew up in northeastern Ohio, and his parents were Robert and Patricia Hoffman. Matthew was an intelligent kid, but many people throughout his life would describe him as strange, odd, awkward. And from a very young age, he was obsessed with trees. He loved trees. He would always be climbing trees. The trees seemed to be an escape for Matthew. He was just always his happiest when he was around trees. And this alone isn't super strange, but this affection for trees seems to ramp up as he gets older. Matthew's parents divorced when he was 17, and after the divorce, he moved with his mother to Mount Vernon, Ohio. And neighbors and friends would say that around this time, Matthew seemed very unhappy. He just seemed lost, which isn't surprising since his parents had just gotten a divorce and he was adjusting to life in Mount Vernon. But one of the neighbors has said that Matthew just creeped her out. This neighbor had a dog that would hang out in the front yard, and anytime that dog saw Matthew, he would just start frantically barking at him. This dog hated Matthew for some reason. And the neighbor would see Matthew just standing in front of her yard, just staring at her dog with like this totally blank look on his face. He would just stand there and stare. It was very unsettling for this neighbor, and so she just tried to keep her distance from Matthew. She just felt like something about him wasn't right. After Matthew graduated high school in 1999, he moved to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. Steamboat Springs is a ski town. There's lots of resorts, lots of tourists. He got a job working as a plumber's assistant, but by the end of his first year in Colorado, Matthew had already gotten himself into some serious trouble. First of all, he stole 3 road signs in Steamboat Springs, and these were not like little signs. These were like big signs, like "Welcome to Steamboat Springs" signs. These signs were huge. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. So like I said, Matthew was working as a plumber's assistant, and one day he was called out to install a garbage disposal in a unit at the Ridge condominium complex. So he installs the garbage disposal, and then he just decided to hang out in the condo. He knew the owners would be gone for weeks, so he just made himself at home. He hung out, he watched TV, he ate some food, he enjoyed the jacuzzi. He essentially lived in that condo for days. He also found the keys to the owner's Suburban, and he decided to just take that out for a spin as well. And he also stole several items around the condo. Eventually, Matthew knew that he had to leave. The owners would be coming back soon, but he also knew that his fingerprints were all over the place. He had essentially been living there for days. So once those people returned and they realized that some of their stuff had been stolen, they would call the police would search for fingerprints, and he could potentially be caught. So Matthew's answer to this problem was to just set the condo on fire. Never mind that there were families staying in the other units in the complex, Matthew didn't care. He just cared about destroying the evidence. So he doused the place with 10 gallons of gasoline, ignited a fire, and then he just walked away. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but this could have been absolutely devastating had the other tenants not escaped. Matthew was caught and he pleaded guilty to all of the charges brought against him, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. And while he was in prison, he was a model prisoner. He didn't cause any trouble. He also took advantage of various programs that the prison offered. And so because of all this good behavior, he was released after only serving 6 years. So now it is 2007 and Matthew is out of prison and he decided to make the move back home to Ohio. He figured if he was going to get his life back on track, the best thing to do would be to move closer to his family. And once he moved back to Ohio, things actually did start to look up for Matthew for a while. He made a few friends, he even got a girlfriend, and he got a job working as a tree trimmer. And he loves this job. He loves being in nature. And remember, he loves trees. He loves being around trees. He loves climbing trees. So this job was perfect for him. And in 2009, Matthew even bought his very first house. This house was in Mount Vernon, about 10 miles from Apple Valley. And his girlfriend and her 8-year-old son moved in with him. And everything seemed great, at first at least. But eventually Matthew started to creep people out again. So when Matthew first moved in, he had a really good relationship with the neighbors. He even brought a dish over to their house and introduced himself and everything. Like he was really, truly trying to make a good impression. The neighbor's name was Donna Davis, and she was a single mother with 3 kids, and her 8-year-old son became really close with Matthew's girlfriend's son. The boys would hang out together. They would go to Matthew's house all the time and jump on the trampoline. The boys would get together and watch movies. Matthew would make them popcorn. He would even let the boys sleep over at his house sometimes, and they had a blast. And Matthew would even give Donna's older daughter rides home from the movies occasionally. That's how much she trusted him. Donna got to know Matthew's girlfriend and they became friends, and for a while everything was perfect. There were no red flags at all. But in the fall of 2010, things suddenly started to go downhill dramatically. The start of this downfall was right around the time that Matthew was fired from his tree trimming job. He had apparently lied about his level of experience, and he also failed to tell them that he had served time in prison. Plus, his coworkers noticed a shift in his behavior. The office manager said there was nothing strange about him in the beginning. He just blended in. But as time went on, he struck me as really strange. He would just stare off into space. And so because of his strange behaviors, he had been in prison and he had not disclosed that information, lying about his experience, Matthew Hoffman was fired in October of 2010. And it's not known if getting fired triggered something in Matthew, but over the course of the next month, his behavior became more and more alarming by the day. Matthew's moods were all over the place. He just didn't seem like his typical friendly self. He was very on edge. He would have massive mood swings. And also he had 2 dogs, and one day they just disappeared. It's still not known what happened to the dogs, but Donna has said that she 100% believes that Matthew killed them. And Matthew also started making Donna's daughter feel uncomfortable as well. Like I said, he would give Donna's daughter a ride home sometimes, and he would typically take a very direct path home, but he started taking the back roads. And sometimes these roads would lead to very remote places, like wooded areas. And Donna's daughter told her mom that she felt uncomfortable with Matthew. He also started setting out squirrel traps around the neighborhood, and he would trap the squirrels, bring them into his house, and then cut them up and eat them. Sometimes he would even go out back and barbecue the squirrels. Donna completely stopped letting her kids go to Matthew's house. She stopped letting him drive her daughter home. She was becoming concerned that Matthew was starting to lose it, and she thought that he could potentially be dangerous. And that fear was confirmed in October of 2010 when Matthew attacked his girlfriend. The girlfriend, whose name I don't know, she had just had enough. The Matthew that she had fallen in love with obviously was gone. He was acting super strange. He had also become very controlling, and she just didn't feel safe. So she packed up her and her son and she left. A few days after she left, she returned to Matthew's house just to pick up a few items that she'd left behind. And as soon as she walked in, an argument broke out. Matthew was obviously not happy that she had left him, and he was ready for a fight that day. But she wasn't interested. She just wanted to grab her stuff and leave. In that moment, something inside of Matthew just snapped, and he shoved her against the wall and he started to choke her. She did manage to break free, but as she was running out of the house, she tripped and fell to the ground. And before she knew it, Matthew was right back on top of her, choking her again. This went on for a couple of minutes points with Matthew choking her fighting him off, and then him choking her again. But finally, she was able to fully break free. And I don't know how she did it, but she did manage to calm Matthew down, and he eventually let her go. She did report the incident to the police, but in the end, she decided not to press charges, so nothing was done. And after his girlfriend left, things just got worse and worse. His neighbors at this point were just straight up scared of Matthew. They would see him climbing up a large tree in his yard, and he would just sit up in this tree for hours, just staring. Matthew was really into staring. The neighbors were just becoming more and more afraid by the day. Donna wouldn't even let her children go outside if he was outside. She wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. And like I said, it's not known if losing his job and losing his girlfriend caused some mental break within Matthew, but his behavior very quickly escalated from strange to psychotic killer in a matter of just a few weeks. So it's now the night of November 9th, 2010, the day before Tina, Sarah, Cody, and Stephanie go missing. Matthew packed up some food and water, a sleeping bag, a blackjack, which is a weapon, and a hunting knife, and he loaded up his car and he headed over to Apple Valley. He parked his car in a parking lot a few miles away from the Apple Valley community. He grabbed his gear and he hiked over to a wooded area on King Beach Drive. And this wooded area just happened to be right across the street from Tina and Greg's home. Matthew set up camp in the woods. He crawled into a sleeping bag and he fell asleep. The next morning at 4 a.m., Greg left for work, and a few hours later, Tina got up. She got the kids ready for school, and she watched as Sarah and Cody got on the bus. Then at around 9:30 that morning, Tina left to run some errands. She went grocery shopping at Kroger, and she also stopped to fuel up her car. Meanwhile, Matthew Hoffman is still sitting in the woods across the street from Tina's house, and he sees his opportunity. He knows that Tina has left. He knows the house is empty, and so he quietly enters the home armed with the blackjack and the hunting knife. It's likely that he got into the house through the garage because the garage door was broken. It wouldn't shut down all the way. It's also likely that Matthew had noticed the broken garage door in the weeks leading up to the crime. Remember earlier I mentioned that Matthew's mother, Patricia, lived very close to Tina in Apple Valley, and so he would have passed by Tina's house on multiple occasions, and he knew that he could easily gain access to the home through that broken garage door. Tina arrived back home around noon, and she started unloading groceries from her truck, and as soon as she walked inside the house, Matthew Hoffman suddenly appeared, and he immediately started his attack. He grabbed Tina and carried her into her bedroom, and this is sadly where Tina lost her life. Matthew hit Tina repeatedly in the head with the blackjack, but she wasn't losing consciousness. And as he's continuing his attack on Tina in the bedroom, her best friend, 41-year-old Stephanie Spring, walked into the house. Stephanie and Tina had plans to go house hunting that day before Tina's shift at Dairy Queen, and unfortunately, Stephanie was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's not known exactly how the attack on Stephanie started, but based on the evidence, it's likely that Stephanie walked in on Matthew attacking Tina in her room. She likely took Matthew by surprise, and as soon as he realized that she was there, he turned his attention to her. Stephanie ran into Sarah's bedroom where Matthew caught up with her, and he stabbed her twice in the chest, killing her almost instantly. But even after Stephanie was dead, Matthew continued to stab her. He stabbed her over and over again. There was blood all over Sarah's room. It was on the ceiling. It was all over the walls. It was all over items in the room. This was a frenzied, rage-filled attack. Once he was finally done with Stephanie, Matthew turned his attention back to Tina. Tina was likely still alive at this point, but unconscious, and Matthew began stabbing Tina all over her body. And just like with Stephanie, even after Tina was obviously dead, he continued to stab her. At one point, he even ripped open her abdomen. So this was overkill to the extreme. And now Matthew had 2 dead bodies to get rid of. So starting with Tina, he drags each of the bodies one at a time to the bathroom. He places them into the bathtub, and using only his hunting knife, he dismembered each of their bodies. And now I'm going to warn you that he does something really terrible to the dog. So if you don't want to hear about that, just skip forward like 20 seconds. So throughout the attacks, the family dog just kept barking nonstop. And Matthew started to worry that all the barking would alert the neighbors. So he killed the dog and then dismembered his body in the bathtub, just like he had done with Stephanie and Tina. He then placed the body parts into some garbage bags that he'd found in the house. And at this point, Matthew had been in the house for several hours, literally since Tina had left to run errands at 9:30 that morning. And it had been so long that the kids were now out of school. Sarah and Cody were getting off the bus, and they started heading inside of the house. And as soon as they walked in, they knew something was very wrong. First of all, their mom always greeted them when they came home from school. She was always right there waiting for them to get off the bus, asking how their day was. But she did not greet them that day. In fact, the house was completely quiet, and they noticed what looked like blood all over the floor in the front part of the house. So the kids started looking around and yelling for their mom, and suddenly Matthew Hoffman stepped out from the hallway and he came directly for the kids. Cody turned towards the front door to try to run out, and at the same time, Sarah dodged Matthew as he came towards her, and she bolted for her bedroom. Matthew decided to go after Cody first since he was about to escape out of the front door. Cody did get in a few good steps towards the front door, but before he could get out, Matthew stabbed him in the back of the head, and he immediately fell to the floor. And then he went to find Sarah. He found Sarah in her bedroom fumbling with her cell phone. She was trying to call 911, but Matthew caught her right before she was able to press send. And Sarah was certain that she was getting ready to die. But instead of stabbing her, Matthew tied her wrists together with an electrical cord, and he told her, "If you scream or try to run, I will kill you." He then picked her up and tossed her over his shoulder and carried her down into the basement, where he found some rope from a sled that he used to tie her ankles together. He then brought her back upstairs and he laid her down on the kitchen floor, and again he warned her not to move, not to make a sound. Sarah could hear the sounds of running water in the bathroom. She could also hear the toilet flushing randomly, and she would see Hoffman going back and forth from the bathroom to the kitchen to grab cleaning supplies and stuff. And of course, what Sarah was hearing was the sounds of Hoffman dismembering her brother's body. And this went on for hours. Sarah was lying on the kitchen floor listening to the sound of Matthew dismembering her brother's body for hours. Once he was done, he blindfolded Sarah and loaded her up in the back of Stephanie's Jeep. And as she's sitting in the Jeep, Sarah could feel that there was something in the back seat with her. She was sitting on something and she couldn't figure out what it was. And she later found out that Matthew had put her on top of her family's dismembered body parts. Now the next part is a little confusing, so stay with me here because things get a little bit hard to explain, because Matthew Hoffman was all over the place the rest of this night and he's trying to get rid of evidence. So Matthew drove Sarah and the bags of the dismembered body parts to a baseball field and he parked in the parking lot. He told Sarah not to move, not to make a sound. He said that he had people outside watching her and she would be killed on the spot if she tried to escape. He left Sarah there in the Jeep with the bags of body parts and he started walking back to get his Toyota Yaris from that parking lot that he'd left it in the night before the murders. His car had been in that parking lot for more than 24 hours at this point and he needed to go get it. So he makes it to his Yaris and he drives back over to the baseball parking lot. He then moved Sarah from the Jeep into his car. He leaves the Jeep filled with body parts in the baseball field parking lot and he drives Sarah over to his house in Mount Vernon. He gets her out of the car and inside the house and he put her on the floor of his bathroom, still tied up, still blindfolded. He then grabs his tree trimming gear and then hopped back into his car and then drives to the local Walmart where he purchased those trash bags and tarps. Now, Matthew's original plan was to dispose of the bodies and then go back to Tina's house and set it on fire to destroy any evidence. But things didn't really go to plan. After he left Walmart, he headed over to a little isolated area near a lake. This lake was close-ish to the baseball field where the Jeep filled with body parts was still parked. So he parks his Yaris at the lake, then he walks to the baseball fields, gets back into the Jeep, and then drives over to a nature preserve. And this is where he was planning to dispose of the bodies. Matthew had been to this nature preserve many times before, and he knew that there was a large hollow beech tree there, and he thought that this would be the perfect place to hide the bodies. So using his tree trimming gear, he hoisted the bags of body parts up and lowered them down into the hollow of the tree. Now he had accomplished the first part of his plan, disposing of the bodies, but he still needed to burn down the house before he felt really secure that he had covered his tracks. So he gets into the Jeep and drives back over to Tina's house, and he swaps the Jeep out for Tina's truck. He parks Stephanie's Jeep in the garage, which is why her Jeep was found there by the police. And for some reason, he took out the Walmart bag with the trash bags and the tarps. He took that out of the Jeep and he left it sitting out in Tina's garage. We don't know why he did this, but it is very lucky that he did because this is what ultimately led to police catching him so quickly. So now that he has Stephanie's Jeep hidden in the garage, he gets into Tina's truck and he starts heading towards a gas station to get some gasoline. But Tina's truck was not in the best shape and it wasn't running right. And so Matthew started to panic that if he broke down on the side of the road, police would spot him and they would start asking questions. Because at this point, it's like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So he decides to just abandon Tina's truck near that hiking trail where it was later found by police. police. Now, at first, I didn't really understand why he swapped the Jeep out for the truck in the first place. Like, why didn't he just use the Jeep to go over to the gas station to get the gas? But I think that he did this because he wanted to make sure that the Jeep was in the garage when the house burned down. That Jeep had carried the bags of body parts. Sarah had been inside of that Jeep. So I think that he wanted to keep the Jeep parked inside the garage just to ensure that it was going to be destroyed by the fire. But it didn't matter in the end anyways, because Matthew never got the chance to burn the house down. Once he abandoned the truck at the hiking trail, he just called it quits and he started walking back to his car at the lake. And by the time he finally made it back to his Yaris, the sun was coming up, so he just headed back home. And unfortunately for Sarah, her nightmare was far from over. So back at Matthew's house, Sarah was still tied up in the bathroom, but he did finally take her blindfolds off. And what she sees in this house was just bizarre. There were drawings all over the walls, like crazy stuff. There were drawings of animals, there were drawings of people, and then like animal people hybrids. There was also a drawing of a middle-aged balding man, and he had drawn it behind the faucet, so it looked like the faucet was coming out of his mouth. Just super off the wall shit. But the absolute weirdest thing about this house was the leaves. Matthew Hoffman had literal leaves, just piles of leaves all around his house, spread out on the floor. He even had bags of leaves nailed to the walls of the bathroom. And Sarah knew in that moment that she was dealing with someone who did not have a tight grasp on reality, and it scared her even more. Matthew eventually moved Sarah down into the basement, and he placed her on top of a bed of leaves. He chained her to a bedpost, and he just left her down there in his dark, freezing cold basement for hours and hours at a time. Sarah wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom, and so she had urinated on herself. And when Matthew would come down into the basement, he would just stand there and stare at her. He wouldn't say a word. He would just stare at her for the longest time, and then he would just turn around and leave. Now, at this point, Matthew still thought that there was a chance he could burn down Tina's house. He just wasn't going to feel secure until the house was burned down. So he decides he needs to go grab his gas cans out of Tina's truck. He had accidentally left them in there when he abandoned her truck. As far as he knew, Tina's truck was still sitting on the side of the road near that hiking trail. So Matthew waited until it got dark and he drove over to the hiking trail. But at this point, there was already a bolo out on Tina's truck. And before he could get out and grab the gas cans, an officer pulled up. This is when that officer asked him what he was doing out there, and he said he was just waiting on his girlfriend, Sarah. He couldn't even come up with a fake name. He actually said Sarah. And of course, at this point, the officer didn't realize that he was talking to the killer, and so he let him go. Sarah was held captive in the basement for a total of 4 days before police found her. And during that time, she was starved, she was kept in the freezing cold dark basement tied up, and she was sexually assaulted as well.
In his basement, they found Sarah bound and gagged on top a makeshift bed of leaves. Authorities say she'd been imprisoned and repeatedly assaulted for 4 days. Miraculously, she was still alive. Hoffman's home was a house of horrors, mysteriously filled with leaves filling the living room, bags of leaves floor to ceiling in the bathroom, a peace sign scribbled on a door, and a knife, dead squirrels in the freezer, but no trace of the other victims.
And thankfully, the police found her when they did, because Matthew was just becoming more and more unhinged by the day. And I truly believe that in the end, he would have panicked and killed Sarah. He was just so unpredictable. Once Matthew was in custody, the police started their interrogation, and they started asking him questions about why he did this, what he had done, where were the other victims. And Matthew wouldn't say a word. He just sat there in total silence. Some officers have said that he almost looked catatonic, and it took a couple of days, but Matthew finally said, okay, I'll give you a full confession, but you have to take the death penalty off the table. The families agreed, and Matthew Hoffman finally started talking. And he finally confirmed what everyone already knew, that Tina, Cody, Stephanie, and the family dog were all dead. Matthew claimed that his motive for breaking into the house that day was solely just to rob the house. According to him, he never planned to hurt anyone that day. It was simply a robbery gone wrong, and it just totally went off the rails in the end. However, no one believes this. Nothing was taken from the house. There was jewelry, purses with cash, lots of valuables inside the home, and he took nothing. And he had also went into the house armed that day. So if it was just a robbery, why would he have brought in weapons? The more likely scenario is that Matthew had seen Sarah Maynard at some point around the neighborhood when he was visiting his mother. He figured out which house Sarah lived in. He noticed that the garage door was broken, and this allowed him easy access. It's very likely that Matthew went there that day with the sole purpose of abducting Sarah, and he just didn't care who he had to kill to accomplish that. And now that police had Matthew's version of events, they needed to know where the bodies were. That was the final piece of the puzzle. So Matthew mapped out the exact location where they could find the bodies. And police found the large hollow beech tree in the nature preserve, and they could see that there were garbage bags down inside of the tree. So they got in a tree surgeon to help them carefully remove the bags, and the first thing they saw when they opened up one of the bags was the face of 11-year-old Cody Maynard and his lifeless eyes just wide open staring back at them. It's just an absolutely tragic, chilling sight.
Finally, he led authorities to the bodies, which he had dismembered and concealed inside a hollow tree.
And all Matthew was worried about this whole time was the safety of the tree. He had more compassion for a tree than he did the 3 people and the dog that he murdered and dismembered. Not to mention the girl that he completely traumatized. Matthew showed no remorse for anything, and he even at one point said that he wished people would just let this thing go because it is what it is. And we don't know for sure if this was Matthew Hoffman's first murders, but there is no doubt in my mind that if Matthew wouldn't have been caught, he would have killed again. Matthew Hoffman is now 43 years old, and he continues to serve his sentence in the Toledo Correctional Institution, and he will never be eligible for parole. During my research, I saw a lot of references to a disorder called dendrophilia, which is the love of trees, sometimes sexual in nature. To my knowledge, Matthew has never officially been diagnosed with this disorder, but many people familiar with this case believe that Matthew had an attraction to trees. And Sarah Maynard struggled a lot in the aftermath of the murders. She went to live with her dad and stepmom, and she suffered with nightmares. She was also out of school for 4 months, and when she returned, some of the kids actually bullied her about being raped, and they would make comments about leaves, just horrible stuff. And then when Sarah was 16, she made the news again when she got a protective order against her dad and her stepmom for abuse. Sarah reported that her father Larry had punched her in the back and her stepmother had kicked her down some stairs. Sarah has done several interviews over the years, and she just seems like an incredibly strong person.
Of course we feel days, where we feel hopeless and we want to give up. Of course, I'm sure all of us feel that way, but we can't.
To be able to pull her life back together after going through such a horrific experience and losing her mom and brother, it's just really an inspiration. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you guys think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget, you can go to drinktrade.com/summer and subscribe and save 30% off your first month. And if you find this type of content interesting, please consider subscribing, commenting, and liking this video, because that is the easiest way for you guys to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.